read the chapter in Muckle, González, and Camp with the incredible title of Archaeology of the Last 5,000 Years. Just throw it all in there. Start off with the fun topic of ancient civilizations, which everybody likes to talk about ancient civilizations, although actually not too many of you like to talk about ancient civilizations, but sometimes people do like to talk about ancient civilizations. The funny thing, or at least to me, is kind of bizarre about this, is that one of the first things they tell us is that there is no agreement on precisely what is meant by civilization. It's kind of a strange thing to say right after the heading of ancient civilizations. These archaeologists are now going to be fighting about what even a civilization is. And so in this class, I'd like to go back to something that we talked about close to the beginning of this section on archaeology, which is something that I asked you not to write down in your notes, so hopefully it isn't there, but it was this idea of what we used to think about society as progressing from man the hunter through man the herder, man the farmer, through civilized man. And of course, we're trying to get rid of that idea, so I shouldn't show it very much. But we've been challenging this idea based on a few things. One is simply the chronological historical order in which these societies emerge, that we see horticulture and then agriculture and then pastoralism. The other is to challenge the idea that it's the mover of history is man, and we've been talking about different gender arrangements and the importance of women and others in gathering and hunting societies, and to challenge the idea that this is a progression, that this goes from one stage to another in a progressive way. And although we may not want to buy the extreme worst mistake ideas, would simply reverse the progression and make it into a cataclysmic catastrophe, which could not also, we want to question the inevitability of the emergence of any of these forms. But today we do want to think about this one, the civilization part, the idea of the civilized, and why is there no agreement on what the term civilization means? You'd think that we could get some agreement on this. So the first thing that I would draw your attention to is what Muckle, González, and Camp call later on page 167, talking about the idea of collapse. They call collapse a loaded term. This term is loaded, and civilization is also a loaded term. And by loaded, that means that this term is something that comes with a whole bunch of emotional reactions that are kind of inherent in the term. And so when we say society collapses and brings up all these ideas about failure and cataclysm and catastrophe. And so one of the reasons why civilization is also a loaded term is that it didn't come to us via people trying to categorize different societies in terms of, okay, we're going to say that every society over 10,000 people with such and such a population. It wasn't actually invented as a technical term in archaeology. It comes to us from outside of archaeology, and it was invented to distinguish us, a civilized people, from the people out there who we would call barbarians or primitives or savages. And we could probably, I think some people go back into the ancient Greek civilization. I think that the term for barbarian was invented because they said that the language of the peoples to north of them just sounded like bar, 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 bar in their words. And so that's where we get the word barbarian. But the idea of the civilization as compared to other societies that we live in, civilized societies, really does have a lot to do with the colonial encounter between the people who would eventually call themselves Europeans and the people that the Europeans would call Americans, in the sense that it eventually becomes a term to describe why people were justified in doing the things that they did in order to set up the colonial order. And so perhaps this is a good day to talk about some of these themes about the colonial order that was instituted after the initial contacts and exchanges. And so again, this is why it is difficult to figure out what civilization precisely means, because the term comes to us already loaded with these connotations and emotional baggage of trying to distinguish a civilized people from an uncivilized people. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that if you look at the definition of civilization and compare it with their definition of a state, well, I think we've gone through this already, but they talk about, this is on page 162, they say that civilization has to have a subsistence based on agriculture, a state level of political organization, at least one city, monumental architecture, talked about that, may include buildings, but also often features other large structures like pyramids or megaliths, and writing. And then they say it is usually the addition of a system of writing that leads archaeologists to describe a society as a civilization. The other characteristics are generally already in place and have been for 1,000 years or more. And the writing part is kind of a giveaway in the sense that then it depends on who you would include in the writing, because technically that may disqualify some of the societies that arose in the Americas because they did not have a writing system which the Europeans recognized. Now, later on, we've realized, or some of the Andean societies, the places where the Inca Empire would eventually arise, used a knotted string system called the quipu in order to do their record keeping, and perhaps even a system of what we might call writing, which was in 3 dimensions, which is completely unrecognizable to Europeans. And so it would be a system of writing. But in some ways, writing implies a kind of self-realization, right? About, okay, the ability to tell your story as a civilization. But if we think about this in terms of what states are, what they told us states were, back on page 156, we learned that states correlate to agriculture. And if a civilization has a state level of political organization, well, a state can say, that's me. That's me. I'm a state level of political organization. And it's hard to imagine a state without at least a city and maybe a monument or some buildings or something. I mean, how could you have a state without that? And it's also difficult to imagine a state without some form of record keeping or writing. So, in fact, states and civilizations, at least from my reading of Muckle, González, and Camp, is that they're basically interchangeable. And so I actually don't see a reason to use the term civilization if it's going to come with those emotional freights. I mean, it's not a problem to use the term civilization, but if you're trying to distinguish the civilized from the uncivilized, then that is a problem. So, Alexa is talking to us. So state society, we could we can probably have also a debate about exactly what constitutes a state society, but it doesn't come to us with that same kind of emotional laden baggage of civilization. And so we can just use state societies. It gets perhaps even more complicated when Muckle and Gonzalez also talk about empires and trying to distinguish a state from an empire might be composed of several different states, so that a one entity that has conquered or subdued different states. Although again, it's hard to decide where one state would begin and where another ends, and what constitutes a state or an empire. But I think, like I said, the technology, the technical term is less important than what we realize as a kind of extension of power in a political system, which is relatively new in human history, where people are able to mobilize the labor power of others to do things. In this section, Muckle, Gonzalez, and Camp also tell us somewhat provocatively that all civilizations eventually collapse. And they give us on page 165 a nice little chart for reasons why civilizations eventually collapse. There's the issue of ecological problems, or people who overexploit their resources. There's social and political conflicts that can happen internally, where there's internal revolutions or resistance to control. And of course, what we perhaps know better, the external, where one society conquers another, and which is some relatively rare actually in human history, but does happen. And then talk about also ideological reasons, that too many resources are spent on religious activity or spent on some kind of activity which does not contribute to the subsistence base and the sustainability of the society. For me, what's important here is, I think for one thing, on page 167, they tell us to be careful of, we often look back and use the term collapse to talk about ancient civilizations, but we look at it through the lens of our own society. So back in the 1960s, people were very fond about talking about internal conflicts. And then the idea of ecological problems rose to prominence. And then people started talking. So we often look back on societies and it's very difficult to interpret why they might have collapsed. We often project our own problems and issues and try to read that into the past. So we have to be careful about that. From my perspective, I think that the term collapse, like Muckle, Gonzalez, and Camp say, is rather loaded. States and empires arise. They can have prominence, and they can fade out, and there's a lot of different reasons why they come and go. So, I think that there's some huge prominent examples which have been debated, but I don't know if we'll ever figure out exactly why societies, states, empires, and civilizations are able to rise and fall, since there's been so many of them over the years. Alex, you talked about one of them that's kind of cool. Happened with those Mayans.
They basically ran out of resources because they were transferring a lot of resources to the war effort, leaving the people that were in the village to starve, basically. And it also kind of has similarities to America during the Vietnam War era, how it was political agendas and stuff like that.
Yeah, so the Maya are an interesting case. This is on a lot spoken about a lot in the box on page 167, the collapse of the Maya, and they kind of illustrate how people have tried to interpret what happened through our own lens. So indeed, it does seem like there were ecological issues, and they seem to have risen and fallen before there was any European contact. So it's kind of always been a mystery, and there also seems to have been in some ways you could call it external conflict as well as ideological reasons trying to contribute to the war effort. But we do have to again be careful not to read this too much through a presentist lens. Like a lot of people did try to use the Maya as an example for ecological stuff or for why we shouldn't get involved in wars overseas. But I think what's kind of, to me, an interesting question here is if like a place like the Maya, a state or an empire or a civilization, if it lasts for over 500 years, are we going to say, oh, wow, they failed or they collapsed? Because if you look at the Maya, it seems like they collapsed, but it's after being around for 2,000 years, and our society, I don't know what we got a couple hundred years or 250 or so, right? I mean, I don't know, are we going to be around another couple hundred? Hard to say. So, I mean, I think we have to be careful when we look back onto the past and we see a society that has come up and been pretty successful and then said to collapse. And the other thing is that, when people talk about the Maya collapse, but, there are people who basically identify as Maya in today's world, and many different indigenous languages in the Yucatan Peninsula are actually derived from Maya languages. And so, it's like I said, you have to be careful with the term collapse. It's a loaded term that can have this idea that everybody has just died and gone away. One of the other parts of this chapter, which is, as we're talking about Maya area and the Mexican Yucatan Peninsula, is the way in which the colonial encounter, between the Europeans and the Americas and other parts of the world, which we'll be talking about on a week from Wednesday, started to transform the world's resource. So, actually, Cass, you talked a little bit about the stuff that happened with cacao. What happened there?
Pretty much took the resource and what had previously been sparingly of specific significant reasons. They kind of watered down the meaning of it and they started using it in every context. And they pretty much took the indigenous peoples away from it, even though it had been a ceremonial thing for them. And they took it out of their control, but then also enslaved them and forced them to make it for the Europeans for monetary gain.
Yeah, so this is a fairly, I mean, a sadly familiar story in many parts of the world where you have this indigenous resource which they cultivate for themselves and in their own context, but the Europeans were, basically took it out of the cultural context and started to grow cacao on a larger scale and using the people who had grown it, but enslaving them in order to do it, and eventually, of course, marry cacao to sugar to give us our wonderful chocolate drinks and things that we can use with chocolate. And then, of course, Christine, what does that eventually give us when we can go buy a chocolate bar right now and get that massive infusion of calories? What do we get? Industrialism, industrialized agriculture, which, as Muckle, González, and Camp point out, in many areas of the world, people have become dependent upon being able to go get a big hit of sugar and chocolate or a big hit of sugar and coffee. Oh, that sounded good right now. In order to keep on doing the things that they're doing, in order to be able to work harder. And so this is something that we're going to be talking about. We're talking about it a little bit now. We're going to be talking about it more on Wednesday when we read our final archaeological article of this unit. And then we'll transition to more talking about that when we come back from break as we transition into our cultural anthropology unit, because we need to know about this process and how these different diverse social and political systems became part of a global system in which you can get a chocolate bar anywhere in the world today. So Muckle, González, and Camp point out that there was a tremendous diversity in terms of subsistence and social systems, those societies that we talked about as foraging, hunting and gathering, pastoralism, agricultural, horticulture, that those systems and those different political systems do still exist today. And they tell us on page 170 that we shouldn't look down upon them if they don't want to be industrialized. They shouldn't be considered inferior or primitive, and that's one of the reasons I'm resisting the idea of the civilized and the uncivilized, or the developed and the undeveloped, because they tell us that in many ways the people that are sort of on the edges of the global change have been able to preserve a healthier lifestyle than those that have been forcibly incorporated into that system. And this is true. I think this is, basically a true statement, but I would caution us that everyone today has become a part of the global system. And so there are some people that are simply marginalized to that, and what they need is more power within the system. It's kind of difficult to be a pastoralist in today's world, but it's the maintenance of diverse systems can actually help us to understand more sustainable ways to live into the future. So again, this is in some ways a prelude to some things that we'll be talking about over the next several classes and into the next unit. But it does come up in this chapter, and so I wanted to highlight it here. Something else that happens in the last 5,000 years, which is rather incredible, is we talked about the human expansion into the Americas and a bit into Australia, but in this time period, people merged together from these areas and spread out into the Pacific Islands, which is a really pretty incredible feat, as Muckle and González and Camp tell us, that the settlement of these islands, you kind of had to be ready to sail off and never come back. And so the seafaring skills and the kinds of stuff that you had to take with you were pretty incredible at this time. It's also kind of sort of mind-boggling to think that that people were in New Zealand apparently only as recently as 1,000 years ago, developed an extremely complex social system on the island. on the islands there. But it was a fairly recent human expansion, but getting out to the famous Easter Island, and we're able to make those big heads. Now, when we talk about these expansions, they tell us to watch out for what is called pseudo-archaeology or fake archaeology. So whenever we talk about Easter Island and the heads and the various structures and pyramids, and we talked about this a bit with the peopling of the Americas, you have to watch out for these ideas that people came from outer space, or they were from ancient Egypt, or all kinds of bizarre ideas that people have tried to promote using archaeology. People are amazing, and they've been able to do some pretty amazing things. Also in this section, and I kind of wish they would have talked about this before when they were talking about the route into the Americas from Europe, we finally get a takedown of the idea that people would have come into that the first Americans were migrants from Europe. They tell us that it requires multiple significant assumptions, which have basically been ruled out. So we have to watch out for, again, archaeological things on TV and in funny books that people want to read, which are fascinating, but simply not supported by the archaeological evidence. So watch out for pseudo-archaeology. Delaney, what the heck? Garbology. What's that?
And I thought that was really funny, and I was telling my friend about it too. And they all thought it was hilarious, but I actually think that it's really interesting. We're looking at household waste and nuclear waste, trash and space, to determine a whole host of things.
Yeah, garbology arose as a kind of archaeology, basically an archaeology of trash. I would say that all archaeology is actually garbology, because we're always looking at the stuff that people leave behind. So in fact, archaeology is just garbology. I probably shouldn't say that too loud because I'll get in trouble, but I mean, it does correspond to what we're looking at basically in many other societies. One of the other interesting things about the study of people's trash was how they used it. I mean, archaeology is always useful, even in societies where you have things that are written down, or you can talk to somebody about what they are doing. So one of the things they did they would ask people what they ate and drank over the course of a week, and then they would compare that with what was found in their trash. And at least among certain adults, they would often get in verbal form, I ate a lot more broccoli and I drank a lot less beer. But if you looked at what was actually in the trash, there seemed to be more bottles and less broccoli. So the difference between what people say and do can often be ferreted out, or can sometimes be ferreted out with something like archaeology. Muckle and González and Camp mentioned that it's also useful, as on page 174, when talking about the history of enslavement and different ideas that people wrote about, but those were the people who were in sort of control of the society, as compared with what the archaeology has of what is happening. And finally, here on garbology, as Delaney has told us, it's very important to understand what we're doing with our trash and how we might do better. I'm sure we've done better, but maybe we're starting to be, and how we might recycle and do things more sustainably in the future. So this is it does sound funny, and it's a good thing to laugh a little bit about, but it actually is a very serious issue in American society, which can lead us to good things. So measure that trash.